The conference hall was a masterpiece of architectural design, its walls a living membrane that shifted between transparency and solid matter. Sarah Chen felt impossibly small, a mere footnote among giants. Her reflection in the morphing walls revealed a woman who looked more like an overworked graduate student than a diplomatic game-changer. Dark circles under her eyes, hair pulled back in a utilitarian bun, fingers constantly tracing patterns on her worn neural interface tablet. She'd been warned about the risks when they first installed the experimental neural implant. "It's not natural," Dr. Yoshida had told her during the final calibration. "The human brain isn't meant to process linguistic patterns at this level of complexity." But Sarah knew something the other researchers didn't, something that haunted her every waking moment. Languages were living organisms. They breathed. They evolved. They carried the DNA of entire civilizations within their grammatical structures. The implant wasn't just a piece of technology. It was a translation engine that did more than convert words. It decoded the very essence of communication. Each alien species in the massive conference hall represented a linguistic universe unto itself. The Krell-Theri delegates stood like living crystals, their bodies refracting light in impossible geometric patterns. Beside them, the luminary representatives existed as pure energy matrices, their communication a dance of electromagnetic pulses that would have been incomprehensible to any standard translation matrix. Sarah's fingers trembled slightly. The neural implant was a secret, not just to the alien delegations, but to most of her own Earth diplomatic team. Only 3 people knew the full extent of its capabilities: herself, Dr. Yoshida, and Ambassador Kimura. A prototype developed in the deepest black sites of human research, it represented humanity's most audacious attempt to understand the fundamental nature of interspecies communication. Most diplomatic translators worked with surface-level communication. They converted words, tracked grammatical structures, and attempted to preserve contextual meaning. Sarah's implant did something far more radical. It analyzed communication as a complex adaptive system, tracking not just words but the evolutionary patterns of linguistic interaction. The Vericon conflict wasn't just a war. It was a linguistic catastrophe that had consumed 17 star systems and millions of lives. 2 civilizations, the silicon-based Krell-Theri and the energy matrix luminary, had been locked in a conflict so complex that most galactic historians had given up understanding its origins. Sarah knew better. Her implant had been processing historical communication records for months, creating a map of linguistic entropy that no one else could see. Every mistranslation, every cultural misunderstanding, every diplomatic incident was a data point in a massive, interconnected web of miscommunication. "You're just a support staff translator," her supervisor had told her when selecting her for the mission. "Keep your head down. Take notes. Don't draw attention." If they only knew the truth burning inside her neural network. The conference chamber hummed with tension. Holographic displays flickered with battle records, each projection a testament to centuries of mutual destruction. Sarah's eyes moved rapidly behind her glasses, the neural implant working overtime. To everyone else, she looked like she was simply adjusting her translation equipment. In reality, she was processing millions of linguistic variables per second, seeing patterns that would drive most human minds to complete breakdown. Something was coming. The implant knew it. She knew it. A linguistic singularity that would either destroy what remained of these 2 civilizations or reveal a truth so profound it would reshape galactic communication forever. Sarah Chen adjusted her glasses and waited. In the grand theater of galactic diplomacy, she was meant to be invisible. A spectator. A footnote. But some footnotes change everything. The moment Ambassador Kthax of the Krell-Theri began speaking, the temperature in the conference chamber seemed to drop. His crystalline body refracted the ambient light, creating a kaleidoscopic effect that was both beautiful and terrifying. Each word was a precision-cut fragment, designed to slice through diplomatic niceties with surgical accuracy. 17 star systems, Fax proclaimed, his voice a resonant frequency that made the translation devices vibrate. 17 systems reduced to quantum dust. And you dare to speak of peace? The luminary representative, Zariel, responded with a burst of electromagnetic energy that sent ripples through the conference hall. To most observers, it appeared as nothing more than a complex light show. But Sarah's neural implant decoded the true communication, a language of pure energy that carried centuries of rage, pain, and unresolved trauma. Around them, diplomats from a dozen starfaring civilizations watched with a mixture of resignation and barely contained anxiety. The Veracum conflict had become more than just a war. It was a galactic cancer that threatened to consume everything in its path. Sarah noticed something most missed. Between the accusations, beneath the violent rhetoric, there was a pattern, a rhythm of communication that spoke of something deeper than mere conflict. Her fingers unconsciously began to trace neural mapping patterns on her tablet, creating intricate diagrams that would have looked like random scribbles to anyone else. The Krelthari delegation stood like a formation of living crystals, each member a precise geometric construct that seemed to pulse with an internal energy. Their bodies were not merely biological. They were computational matrices, capable of processing information at speeds that would make human supercomputers look like abacuses. Zariel of the Luminary moved with a different kind of presence. As an energy matrix being, she didn't so much stand as exist, a complex interchange of electromagnetic frequencies that represented consciousness in its most abstract form. When she spoke, the very air seemed to vibrate with unspoken tensions. You speak of destruction. Zariel's communication burst. But you ignore the fundamental breach of our initial communication protocols. The translation devices struggled, producing a garbled mess that captured only a fraction of the true meaning. But Sarah heard everything. Her neural implant was creating a real-time map of the linguistic battlefield. Each word was a data point, each pause a potential breakthrough. The conflict wasn't just about territory or resources. It was a catastrophic failure of communication, so profound that it had become self-perpetuating. Ambassador Kimura from the Earth delegation shifted uncomfortably. He knew they were witnessing something beyond a standard diplomatic incident. This was a collision of communication systems so complex that traditional mediation would be like using a child's crayon to repair a quantum computer. The holographic displays told a brutal story. Star systems reduced to quantum foam. Entire civilizations erased from existence. 17 systems, each one a universe of potential, now nothing more than cosmic dust. And at the center of it all, Sarah Chen. To everyone else, she was just another support staff translator, her fingers moving almost absently across her tablet. Her neural implant processed linguistic data at a rate that would have driven a normal human mind to complete breakdown. Something was brewing. The patterns were becoming clear. A linguistic singularity was approaching. A moment of communication so pure, so fundamental, that it would either destroy what remained of these civilizations or reveal a truth that could reshape galactic understanding forever. Sarah watched and waited. Chaos has its own poetry, its own mathematics. The moment existed in a fraction of a second, a data point so infinitesimal that most would have missed it entirely. Sarah's datapad slipped from her trembling fingers, cascading to the floor in an arc that would change galactic history forever. The diagrams spread like a living neural network across the conference hall's crystalline floor. Intricate lines of communication mapping, probability matrices, and linguistic entropy calculations created a visual symphony that was simultaneously beautiful and terrifying. Her neural implant had been working overtime, unconsciously creating a map of communication patterns that defied traditional understanding. What looked like random scribbles to the untrained eye was actually a complex linguistic topology, a three-dimensional representation of communication breakdown that traced the evolutionary path of conflict across multiple civilizations. Zariel of the Luminary was the first to react. Her energy matrix, typically a chaotic dance of electromagnetic frequencies, suddenly stabilized. The rapid oscillations that represented her standard communication pattern froze, creating a moment of absolute silence that dragged across centuries of conflict. Impossible. The translation device stuttered, struggling to capture the complexity of Zarl's response. Ambassador Cathax of the Krell theory shifted, his crystalline body refracting light in impossible geometric patterns. The diagrams on the floor caught in his prismatic structure, creating a holographic explosion of data that hung in the air like a three-dimensional star map. Sarah's hand moved unconsciously. Years of research, months of covert data collection, countless sleepless nights analyzing communication patterns, they had all led to this moment. The neural implant wasn't just a piece of technology. It was an extension of her consciousness, a bridge between human cognitive limitations and something far more profound. The diagrams told a story that no one had been able to see. It wasn't just about the Vericon conflict. It was about the fundamental nature of communication itself. Each line represented a mistranslation, each intersection a moment of cultural misunderstanding that had snowballed into generations of destruction. Dr. Yoshida's warning echoed in her mind. The human brain isn't meant to process linguistic patterns at this level of complexity. But Sarah had always known something the other researchers didn't. Language was alive. It breathed. It evolved. It carried the genetic memory of entire civilizations. The conference hall became a living canvas. Diplomats from a dozen star-faring civilizations stood frozen, their sophisticated translation matrices struggling to comprehend the complexity spread across the floor. What Sarah had created was more than a diagram. It was a living map of communication itself. Ambassador Kimura's hand moved slightly, a gesture so subtle that only Sarah noticed. He knew. Of all the humans in the room, only he understood the true potential of what was unfolding. Zarl's energy matrix began to pulse in a rhythm that matched the diagrams. The Krell theory delegates' crystalline structures shifted, catching and refracting the light of the linguistic map. For the first time in centuries, two civilizations on the brink of mutual destruction found themselves united by something beyond conflict. A single diagram. A moment of accidental revelation. Sarah Chin, the invisible translator, the support staff member meant to fade into the background, had just become the most dangerous person in the galaxy. And she was just getting started. The silence was absolute. Sarah's explanation began as a whisper, a thread of sound that gradually wove itself into the fabric of the conference hall. Her neural implant synchronized with the translation systems, transforming her words into a multi-dimensional communication that transcended traditional linguistic barriers. It's not about what was said, she began, her fingers tracing the complex diagram that still covered the floor, but about what couldn't be heard. The diagram was more than a simple representation of communication. It was a living, breathing autopsy of conflict itself. Each line represented a moment of misunderstanding. Each intersection, a cultural mistranslation that had metastasized into generations of violence. Zarl of the Luminary moved closer, her energy matrix pulsing in synchronized rhythm with Sarah's explanation. The Krell theory delegates, previously rigid and confrontational, began to shift, their crystalline structures refracting light in patterns that suggested something close to comprehension. Sarah revealed the impossible. The Vericon conflict wasn't a war in the traditional sense. It was a catastrophic communication breakdown that had been building for centuries. She demonstrated how a single mistranslation during the first contact between the Krell theory and Luminary had created a cascading effect of misunderstandings. "Look here," she said, pointing to a complex node in her diagram. This linguistic pattern suggests that what the Krell theory understood as a hostile declaration was actually a diplomatic greeting in Luminary communication protocols. The neural implant worked at the edges of human cognitive capability. It wasn't just translating words. It was decoding the entire contextual framework of interspecies communication. Sarah showed how cultural nuances had been weaponized, how communication had become a battlefield more destructive than any physical conflict. Ambassador Kimura watched with a mixture of pride and apprehension. The experimental technology they had developed was working beyond their wildest expectations. Sarah was doing more than presenting a theory. She was dismantling the very foundations of an intergalactic conflict. The Krell representative, Ambassador Cathax, spoke for the first time without aggression. "Explain," he demanded, his crystalline structure vibrating with a frequency that suggested genuine curiosity. Sarah's diagram began to move. Holographic projections erupted from the floor, creating a three-dimensional map of communication patterns. It was like watching the autopsy of a civilization's misunderstandings. Each mistranslation, each cultural misinterpretation laid bare in exquisite, painful detail. She demonstrated how linguistic entropy had created a self-perpetuating cycle of conflict. Words that were meant to be conciliatory were interpreted as threats. Cultural metaphors became weapons. What had started as a simple misunderstanding had evolved into a generations-long destruction of entire star systems. The diplomats from other civilizations leaned forward. This was more than a diplomatic breakthrough. This was a fundamental reimagining of interspecies communication. Zariel's energy matrix began to pulse in a way that the translation devices could only partially capture. Emotion. Understanding. Something close to grief. "We never heard each other," the luminary representative communicated, the translation devices struggling to capture the full complexity of the statement. Sarah Chen, the invisible translator, the support staff member meant to fade into the background, had just revealed the true nature of the most destructive conflict in galactic history, and she was just getting started. Pandemonium erupted. The conference hall transformed into a crucible of linguistic chaos. Diplomats from 17 different starfaring civilizations converged on Sarah Chen, their sophisticated translation matrices working overtime to process the implications of her breakthrough. Dr. Elena Rodriguez from the Terran Xenolinguistic Research Division pushed forward, her augmented eyes scanning Sarah's diagrams with a predatory intensity. "This is impossible," she muttered, though her voice carried a note of barely contained excitement. No single translation matrix could have decoded these communication patterns. Ambassador Cathax of the Krell moved with a fluidity that belied his crystalline structure. His prismatic body caught the holographic projections, creating a light show that danced across the conference hall's walls. "Explain," he demanded, his voice a resonant frequency that made the translation devices vibrate. Sarah's neural implant worked at the bleeding edge of human cognitive capability. To the outside observer, she appeared calm, almost detached. In reality, she was processing linguistic data at a rate that would have driven a normal human mind into complete sensory overload. The luminary representative, Zariel, began to pulse with an electromagnetic frequency that suggested something close to emotional revelation. Her energy matrix, typically a chaotic dance of charged particles, had stabilized into a complex, almost mathematical pattern that mirrored Sarah's communication diagram. Ambassador Robert Kimura watched from the periphery, a veteran diplomat who had seen countless interstellar negotiations. But this was something entirely different. The experimental neural implant they had developed in the deepest black sites of human research was performing beyond their most optimistic projections. Diplomatic protocols began to dissolve. Representatives from the Arcturian Confederacy, the Nexus Collective, and the Quantum Concordance surrounded Sarah, their translation devices struggling to capture the full complexity of what was unfolding. What had begun as a routine diplomatic conference was transforming into something unprecedented. "Do you understand what you've done?" Dr. Rodriguez pressed, her augmented eyes scanning every minute detail of Sarah's diagram. "This isn't just a translation. This is a complete deconstruction of interspecies communication." Sarah remained calm. The neural implant wasn't just a piece of technology. It was an extension of her consciousness. Years of research, countless sleepless nights analyzing communication patterns, had led to this moment. The holographic projections continued to shift, revealing layers of miscommunication that had fueled the Vericon conflict for generations. Each line, each intersection told a story of misunderstanding so profound that it had consumed entire star systems. Ambassador Cathax's crystalline structure began to refract light in patterns that suggested something close to emotional vulnerability. The Krell, a species known for their rigid computational approach to communication, were experiencing something unprecedented. Zarl moved closer to Sarah, her energy matrix pulsing in a rhythm that seemed to synchronize with the linguistic diagrams. "We never heard each other," the luminary representative communicated, the translation devices capturing only a fraction of the statement's true complexity. The Earth delegation watched in stunned silence. Ambassador Chimera caught Sarah's eye for a brief moment, a look of understanding that spoke volumes. They both knew this was more than a diplomatic breakthrough. This was a quantum leap in interspecies communication. And Sarah Chen, the invisible translator, the support staff member meant to fade into the background, had just become the most dangerous person in the galaxy. The next hour became a psychological battlefield more complex than any physical conflict humanity had ever witnessed. Sarah found herself in a sealed conference chamber, surrounded by the most advanced minds in the galaxy. Her neural implant worked at a fever pitch, processing communication patterns that would have driven a normal human mind into complete breakdown. The walls themselves seemed to breathe with tension, morphing between transparency and solid matter as the diplomatic interrogation intensified. Zarl of the Luminary moved with an electromagnetic grace that defied traditional understanding of movement. "Explain," the energy matrix demanded, her communication pulses creating intricate patterns that danced just beyond the edge of human perception. Ambassador Cathax of the Krell positioned himself opposite Sarah, his crystalline body refracting light in geometric patterns that suggested both mathematical precision and emotional complexity. The experimental translation devices struggled to capture the full depth of the communication. "It's not about what was said," Sarah began, her voice steady despite the psychological pressure, "but about the fundamental architecture of communication itself." She began to deconstruct the linguistic patterns that had fueled the Vericon conflict. Each explanation was a surgical strike against centuries of misunderstanding. Her neural implant transformed complex theoretical concepts into a visual language that transcended traditional communication barriers. Dr. Elena Rodriguez from the Terran Xenolinguistic Research Division watched with a predatory intensity. The neural implant was performing beyond their most optimistic projections, a technological breakthrough that challenged everything humanity understood about interspecies communication. The sealed chamber became a crucible of cognitive exploration. Sarah demonstrated how linguistic entropy had created a self-perpetuating cycle of conflict. Cultural metaphors became weapons. Diplomatic protocols transformed into intricate traps of misunderstanding. Zarl's energy matrix began to pulse in a rhythm that suggested something close to emotional revelation. The luminary representative's communication patterns shifted, becoming more fluid, more responsive. It was as if the very act of listening was rewiring fundamental communication protocols. Ambassador Cathax's crystalline structure began to vibrate with a frequency that suggested genuine intellectual curiosity. The Krell, a species known for their computational approach to existence, were experiencing something unprecedented, true understanding. "We never heard each other," Cathax communicated, the translation devices capturing only a fraction of the statement's true complexity. Sarah's diagram continued to evolve. Holographic projections erupted from hidden systems, creating a three-dimensional map of communication patterns that told the true story of the conflict. It was like watching the autopsy of an entire civilization's misunderstandings. Each mistranslation, each cultural misinterpretation laid bare in exquisite, painful detail. Ambassador Robert Kimura watched from the periphery, a veteran diplomat who understood the true magnitude of what was unfolding. The experimental technology they had developed in the deepest black sites of human research was performing a diplomatic miracle. The representatives from other starfaring civilizations watched in stunned silence. This was more than a breakthrough in diplomatic communication. This was a fundamental reimagining of how intelligent species could understand each other. Sarah Chen, the invisible translator, the support staff member meant to fade into the background, was systematically dismantling the foundations of an intergalactic conflict. And she was just getting started. The final diplomatic session was nothing like anyone had anticipated. The conference hall transformed into a quantum theater of communication, with Sarah Chen as its unexpected protagonist. Her neural implant had become more than a technological marvel. It was a bridge between civilizations that had been perpetually at war. Ambassador Cathax of the Kreltheri spoke first, his crystalline structure pulsing with a vulnerability that would have been unimaginable hours earlier. "We have been blind," he communicated, the translation devices struggling to capture the full depth of his statement. The words carried the weight of 17 destroyed star systems, of generations of meaningless conflict. Zarl of the Luminary responded with an electromagnetic burst that was simultaneously an apology, a revelation, and a complete deconstruction of their previous communication protocols. The energy matrix that had once represented pure aggression now vibrated with a complex emotional resonance that defied traditional understanding. Sarah stood at the center of the diplomatic storm, her fingers tracing the now familiar linguistic diagrams that had become a living map of communication itself. Ambassador Robert Kimura watched with a mixture of pride and apprehension. The experimental technology they had developed was rewriting the rules of interstellar diplomacy in real time. "Communication is not just about words," Sarah explained, her voice steady and clear. "It's about understanding the fundamental architectural patterns of how different consciousness systems interpret reality." The representatives from other starfaring civilizations leaned forward. The Arcturian Confederacy, the Quantum Concordance, the Nexus Collective, all found themselves witnesses to a diplomatic breakthrough that would reshape galactic relations. Dr. Elena Rodriguez from the Terran Xenolinguistic Research Division activated her augmented display, tracking every minute detail of the communication process. The neural implant was performing beyond their most optimistic projections, transforming complex theoretical concepts into a visual language that transcended traditional communication barriers. Cathax's crystalline structure began to resonate with Zoril's energy matrix in a harmonic convergence that suggested something close to mutual understanding. The translation devices struggled to capture the nuanced communication, part apology, part revelation, part fundamental reconstruction of their entire cultural paradigm. "We mistook difference for hostility," Zaril communicated, the electromagnetic pulses creating a visual symphony of regret and understanding. Every misinterpreted communication became a weapon. Every cultural metaphor a potential trigger for destruction. Sarah's diagram continued to evolve, holographic projections showing the intricate path of miscommunication that had consumed 17 star systems. It was more than a historical analysis. It was a living autopsy of conflict itself. The diplomatic protocols that had governed interstellar relations for centuries began to dissolve. What had seemed like an immutable system of communication was revealed to be nothing more than a complex misunderstanding, a linguistic cage that had trapped entire civilizations. Ambassador Kimura caught Sarah's eye. A single moment of understanding passed between them. They both knew this was more than a diplomatic breakthrough. This was a quantum leap in how intelligent species could communicate. The Kreltheri and Luminary delegations moved closer together, their previously rigid communication structures becoming fluid, adaptive. The very act of listening was rewiring fundamental diplomatic protocols. Sarah Chen, the invisible translator, the support staff member meant to fade into the background, was systematically reconstructing the foundations of interstellar communication. And she was just getting started. The aftermath was nothing short of revolutionary. 36 standard galactic hours after Sarah Chen's unprecedented linguistic breakthrough, the first comprehensive peace treaty in the history of the Vericon conflict was signed. But it was more than a mere document. It was a complete reimagining of interstellar communication. News networks across multiple star systems broadcast the unprecedented event. Sarah stood slightly to the side, almost invisible among the towering diplomatic representatives. Yet everyone knew she was the catalyst that had transformed 17 systems of perpetual conflict into a potential pathway for understanding. Ambassador Robert Kimura approached her, his experienced diplomat's eyes filled with a mixture of pride and wonder. "Do you understand what you've done?" he asked quietly. "You've rewritten the fundamental rules of galactic diplomacy." The neural implant, that experimental piece of technology developed in the deepest black sites of human research, had become more than a translation device. It was a bridge between consciousness systems, a technology that demonstrated humanity's most profound capability, the ability to truly listen and understand. Zaril of the Luminary and Ambassador Kthax of the Kreltheri stood side by side, their previous antagonism dissolved into a complex communication pattern that defied traditional diplomatic protocols. Their representatives moved with a synchronicity that would have been impossible hours earlier. Dr. Elena Rodriguez from the Terran Sinolinguistic Research Division was already drafting comprehensive research papers. The neural implant technology represented a quantum leap in communication studies, a breakthrough that would be studied for generations. It was never about the words, Sarah explained to a gathering of sinolinguistic researchers. It was about the spaces between the words, the cultural contexts, the unspoken assumptions that create barriers more impenetrable than any physical wall. The galactic community began to reassess everything they understood about interspecies communication. The Vericon conflict, a generations-long destruction that had consumed entire star systems, was revealed to be nothing more than a catastrophic misunderstanding. Diplomatic missions from dozens of starfaring civilizations began requesting meetings with Sarah. The quiet translator, who was never meant to be more than background support, had become the most sought-after communication expert in the known galaxy. The peace treaty itself was unprecedented. It wasn't just a cessation of hostilities. It was a comprehensive reconstruction of communication protocols. The Kreltheri and Luminary committed to joint research programs, cultural exchange initiatives, and a complete dismantling of the communication barriers that had fueled their conflict. Ambassador Kimura watched Sarah with a knowing smile. The experimental technology they had developed was performing beyond their most optimistic projections. Humanity, previously considered a minor, emerging species, was now viewed as something entirely unexpected. "We are not just a species that communicates," Sarah would later write in her groundbreaking research. "We are a species that seeks to understand." The neural implant continued to work, processing linguistic data at a rate that would have driven a normal human mind into complete sensory overload. But for Sarah, it was becoming something more, a bridge between different ways of experiencing consciousness. As the diplomatic sessions concluded, one thing became abundantly clear. The most powerful weapon in the universe wasn't technology or military might. It was the ability to listen, to truly hear. Sarah Chen, the invisible translator, the support staff member meant to fade into the background, had just changed the course of galactic history. And she was just getting started.